it is rare to see this kind of economic interdependence, and it does provide strongly self-interested reasons for not upsetting the apple cart. And this may be a political scientist economist sort of, or maybe a lawyer economist difference. People do irrational and stupid things sometimes, and in the U.S. there is this near paranoia about the significance of Chinese-owned U.S. debt and what that means. Now, one gets in those debates in the U.S., and the answer always is the old joke. If you owe your banker a little money, you have a problem. If you owe your banker a lot of money, he has a problem. So there are not too many other options. But I think it is, when cooler heads prevail, which is most of the time, one of the foundations for what has been a stable relationship. And I don't see that going anywhere. But there are two ways in which it's a narrative. One is the U.S. paranoia about Chinese-owned U.S. debt and whether China will try to use that to political ends. I think that's unlikely, but it's there, and I think it does lead to one of the points Pieter was talking about, which is this sort of investment relationship. That because there's so many dollars sloshing around out there that need to be recycled, it fuels all because many of them are channeled through large state-owned Chinese enterprises. It becomes another friction point as Huawei or Sino or somebody comes and buys U.S. assets, so it gets political in that sense. And I think there's also this is partly following on comments earlier today about the Chinese lessons from the sort of comeuppance of American capitalism after the global financial crisis, and as Pieter was saying. That part of the story of Chinese resentment or suspicion of what the U.S. is up to in an anti-China agenda is the sense that the U.S. is profoundly hypocritical on economic issues. We talk about a liberal economic order, but we're free riding on it with debt. We talk about liberal investment, but we politicize, in the Chinese view, a lot of inbound investment. We do those kinds of things that I think raise these kinds of suspicions. And so it is, you're right about the fundamentals and the incentives of self-interest it creates, but politics is not a rational sport.
Yeah, if I may follow this, actually in domestic American politics, isn't it true that we Americans try to characterize the political opponents in ways that is much more a distortion of the fact, and to the kind of political extreme that completely distorting the opponent's basic stand. For example, to what extent the term liberal has been demonized in the United States of America. Then China is fortunate. The kind of American paranoia toward China, in my judgment, is much smaller, much less than what we have seen in many occasions in domestic American politics. Is that true? No. Or maybe
the demonization problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
Thinking about.
I think if you talk about attitudes toward China in U.S. politics, the short answer is almost nobody really cares, right? I mean, foreign policy is not a high salience issue for the American electorate, but that doesn't mean it's not volatile, and so it can be made into a political issue. I mean,
No, but thinking about the campaign time, this is the least, accountable question. Therefore, the China question, right? Is therefore both candidates try to bring it into the debate until a moment that they suddenly find they will have to commit to it.
The foreign policy debate in the last presidential election was about three things. Yes. It was about getting out of Afghanistan and Iraq, mostly Afghanistan, because that's Americans dying in foreign lands, and that always has domestic resonance. The second one was about Jewish votes in Florida. The third one was about steelworker votes in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And China got mentioned only in the last context, which is a loss of jobs thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wonder if it's a big danger in extrapolating the obvious polarization in American politics from domestic issues to foreign affairs. After all, just last week, Senator John McCain introduced Senator John Kerry for his confirmation proceedings in the most glowing terms. And of course, they're both Vietnamese veterans. So there is obviously going to be a certain continuity and probably far less division on foreign policy than there are on domestic issues. The second point, which was not raised this morning, is the tensions between China and Vietnam, and of which both those senators I've named have taken a long interest, not just since the war, but ever since. And of course, Vietnam does not have any kind of defense pact with the United States, and whether you see Vietnam as a possible flashpoint.
Yes. No, first you and yes.
There are two things that the US and China shared lately, and those two things are the Nobel Peace Prize.
The what?
Nobel Peace Prize. I'm going to focus on the Chinese Nobel Peace Prize, given the fact that I'm Norwegian. How was this perceived in China? That's my first question. And how do you think the energy policy will be shaping the coming Chinese, European, and American foreign policy?
That's a question for me.
To the whole country.
First of all, the first Nobel Peace Laureate from China is a person whose name is the Dalai Lama. Actually, this is what he told me personally. He said, I am the first Chinese to receive the Nobel Prize.
Sorry, I'm talking about Liu Xiaobo or?
Of course, then Liu Xiaobo is the first PRC citizen to receive the Nobel Prize. And I think, this actually is a test case to what extent. One thing that is for certain, he does not belong to the prison. Let's see. This is what Mo Yan actually said in his interview in Beijing. Later he changed. But let's be very, very, hopeful that at one point, some kind of action taken on Liu Xiaobo by releasing him is a very big, symbolically and politically and practically thing to watch. I hope this will happen. And energy sharing, you want to say something?
Just a couple quick things. You're right about U.S. foreign policy. There's a lot of elite autonomy on that, and there's less division. And I always tell my Chinese friends that the best thing for U.S.-China relations is for a U.S. election not to focus on U.S.-China relations. I mean, these know what they're doing. The Liu Xiaobo thing obviously got very negative press in China, officially. I mean, obviously there's a lot of public sympathy, but it was another occasion to say this is a Western agenda of trying to change China, peaceful evolution, that sort of thing. But on the energy stuff, I mean, I think we don't know quite what's going to happen there, but just what Pieter has to say on this. But the shale gas revolution in the U.S. is really a significant thing. I mean, the U.S. is about to become pretty close to energy independent, quite possibly, if this pans out. That's hugely transformative, and it's already been headed down that path. I mean, the U.S. Navy commitment to keeping the Middle East oil lanes open is not for the U.S. directly. It is indirectly because the Japanese and East Asian economies depend on it, but we don't. But the other piece of this is that I think, there was too much hype about the idea that China was pursuing equity oil, that it was trying to lock up energy resources as state-owned things. It's complicated and it's a problem, but that's not the problem. The problem is state-linked national oil companies get cheap capital, they don't behave as fully market actors, and then they go and overpay for assets. So they are this kind of strange phenomenon out there in international energy markets. But the whole Sino-Unicao thing, I think, mercifully, has faded as an energy sector-specific problem, but as Pieter was mentioning, it can recur in other sectors that it has with Huawei and high tech, and I think you're going to see more of it in dual-use, security-sensitive technology more than anything else.
Yeah, if I can quickly follow up on this, actually shale gas reserve, China is also big. China is perceived as a possible number one, at least the number two, country with that shale gas reservation in the world, and that will supply China for a very, very long time. And this is an area actually Chinese-American cooperation could be very effective because China still does not have the technology.
Assuming that fracking doesn't cause earthquakes and water pollution.
And also, actually, in my state, New York State, we have this local, provincial protest against oil, shale gas drilling. And in China, that's less likely. Yes.
Yeah, okay. My question is about China's second largest economy in the world. Renminbi is still not a reserve currency. My question is, what's your comment on the long-term and short-term possibility for the internationalization of renminbi? And do you think the rise of China puts a challenge to the dollar-dominant, post-Bretton Woods financial system? And the second question is to the Mr. Chen, Professor Chen. Since by Japanese constitution and the U.S.-Japan alliance, Japan has no defense power to defend its own territory. So what's your comment on the U.S. role in the Senkaku and Deolry alliance?
Well, talk of the renminbi. I think the renminbi is the only major currency that has the potential to become an international reserve currency in the next 5-10 years. And the implications of that are potentially very, very great. Right now, the US, being the custodian of the prime international currency, 63% of global reserve currencies are held in US dollars. The possible competition with the renminbi could be a very beneficial element in US domestic policies. Right now, the US can do things like borrowing in its own currency at very low interest rates and very low risks that it cannot take for granted once the international financial system has been modified so as to include the renminbi as a reserve currency, along with the dollar, along with the euro. So, and that's likely to happen. The Chinese financial authorities have been remarkably silent on that subject. They've only been talking about renminbi internationalization, using the currency for trade settlement, for investment financing, but there is no official statement which says that the Chinese government aims at making the renminbi a major international reserve currency, right? I personally think that is one of the intentions, unspoken. And it may happen sooner than you think, because the Chinese in the last 12 months have actually done quite a lot to open up the financial system. There's a lot more movement on the financial side than people have taken note of. They've liberalized the exchange rate management, widening the band from 1% to 2%. They've allowed deposit and lending rates a bit more flexible. They've vastly increased the limit of foreign direct investment in China in the QFII scheme, the portfolio money. They've promoted now also the return of renminbi denominated funds in Hong Kong to the mainland, the RQFII scheme. If you add it all up, it's more than marginal change. I would not be surprised that if the financial boys continue to reign this game, that the renminbi will be a fully convertible currency within the next 5 years. And it will then almost automatically become also usable as an international reserve currency, provided there are enough renminbi floating around, which China cannot hope to achieve through a trade deficit because China has a trade surplus. So the only way China can assure the availability of renminbi in the international financial arena is through investment. Large-scale Chinese renminbi-denominated investment in the rest of the world. Then the renminbi could become a reserve currency.
Yeah, very quickly about your second point. I think the United States of America is playing a constructive stabilizing role in the dispute. And U.S. is responsible for Japan's peace constitution, and in the current situation, it will be surprising to see the United States is to change that policy. And the fundamental principle of the United States of America in that area is not ambiguous. It's a very clear status quo. And then what the status quo is, it's not defined by the United States of America. It's by China and Japan. And how can that be defined? Through negotiation, dialogue. And this is what we now are seeing to happen. Hopefully, it will establish some kind of new mutual understanding of the current status quo. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Please be very quick.
Yeah,
Because
thank you,
officially,
Professor.
this clock is wrong. It's a 0, but actually I see we have 4 more minutes.
So we're talking about Sino-American relations or Sino-Japan relations. What's your point of view of Taiwan's role in this issue? I feel like mainland Taiwan has become like neither unified or separated in the recent years. So do you think it will still affect the relations, or it will become more like marginalized issue? Thank
That's
you.
me?
The
Okay, yes, please.
Oh boy. We could be here quite a while. Well, you know, we keep talking about the Senkaku Diaoyu. We haven't talked about the Diaoyu Dao. You know, that is, these are Diaoyu Tai. We have the Diaoyu Dao, but the Diaoyu Tai. Right. So we've got, you know, Diaoyu from the mainland, Diaoyu Tai from Taiwan, and Senkaku from Japan. You know, we've read Taiwan out of this, but it's part of the South China Sea dispute. It's part of the East China Sea dispute. You know. There has been this huge sigh of relief in Washington and in Beijing that Taiwan is no longer a flashpoint in U.S.-China relations, right? I mean, the Chen Shui-Bian years were not that long ago. I think in both capitals, people who worry about the Taiwan component in bilateral relations are, you know, still delighted that Mangzhou has taken a rather different path. But I wouldn't get too sanguine about it for two reasons. One is that although Taiwan affairs play much less of an independent role in U.S. foreign policy and play much less of a role in the U.S.'s China policy than they used to, there are two things you have to watch out for. One is that if U.S.-China relations continue to deteriorate on the security front, and I don't mean hit crisis, but have this sort of mutual mistrust and this preparing for the worst quality, the thinking about Taiwan in the U.S. changes. For a long time, the trend had been that Taiwan was the most likely cause of an unnecessary crisis and possible military conflict between the U.S. and China. Taiwan was a stumbling block back to the old Kissinger view of better it went away. That has begun to be rethought, and as particularly the Department of Defense does what the Department of Defense is supposed to do, which is think about bad case scenarios, not likely case scenarios, but bad case scenarios. When you plot that out, Taiwan starts to look like a strategic asset again. It hems the Chinese Navy in, it creates a friendly place in the region, you know, and so you see that kind of thinking, I think, re-emerging as the DoD does these, and as Congress has mandated the DoD do this in a very public way. The second thing is there's been great rapprochement in cross-strait relations. There are a lot of gains that have been reaped for both sides from that. But Mangzhou's strategy is 先进后战. Right? Eventually you work through the Jing and you work through the Yi, and you're stuck with the Nan and the Zheng. I mean, you get to the hard political questions, and there's much less consensus in Taiwan about where to go on that than there has been about economic relations.
If I may, we don't have time, but if I may use my chair as a privilege to say the last word. You know, Taiwan issue, in essence, is also something concerning the very legitimacy of what China was, what China has been, what China is, and what China will be. And this is a very, very big challenge, because do we allow mainland China occupy or liberate or incorporate Taiwan, or do we allow Taiwan to transform China? You know, that is a very China-centered question, but it is related to the larger picture concerning China's comprehensive political reforms. This is a very unsortable comment. Oh yes, Jacques.
You'll have the last word.
No. I would rather give that to you.
I think this Taiwan question is so important. Just a supplementary comment on economic financial issues. Just a few weeks ago, the first cable was laid underneath the Taiwan Straits. ICBC has opened an office in Taipei. Taipei and Shanghai have a bilateral agreement sanctioned by Beijing, making the conversion of money from Taiwanese dollar to Chinese renminbi easy between Taiwan and Taipei. The two central banks have recently agreed on new clearance mechanisms to use the renminbi for the clearance of trade. About 70% of Taiwan's external trade is now with mainland China. It used to be with the US, it's always mainland China. Ma Ying-jeou was elected last year, and the expectation that some people have, now I'm going outside my economic area, is that they will finally actually sit down around the table to see if they can negotiate something like an end of hostilities agreement. Right? The Civil War was never completed. 49 was not the end of the Civil War. It's still going on in ways. But there are strong voices on the two committees that negotiate on behalf of the two governments to actually put an end, a formal end, to the Civil War. That will be a breakthrough of monumental importance if it happens, and it could
We
happen.
would love to see that.
With this very thoughtful, these comments, let me conclude this session. Thank you very much.
If I can just have your attention for a second, thank you there. Two things. Firstly, the gentleman has lost his goodie bag with his personal items in it. If you do see it, please hand it in to one of our volunteers. And secondly,